Good afternoon, welcome to EduSat Network. Friend, today we are going to discuss a very important topic, psychology of motivation. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio Dr. Arvind Misra. He teaches psychology in Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is associate professor in Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies. And Dr. Misra has authored two books. The name of the one book is Interrogating Development, that has come from the Oxford publication, and the other book is School Education, Pluralities and Marginalities from Comparative Perspectives, and that has come from the Orient Black Swan publication. So I think his knowledge and experience will help us to understand this topic and give how to understand psychology of motivation. So on your behalf, I welcome Dr. Misra for EduSat lecture on this very topic. Welcome, Misra.
Okay, thank you. Hello students. Today we are going to discuss one of the very important topic in the area of psychology. Some of you who are familiar with the various branches of psychology. So topic of motivation comes under general psychology, or we sometimes call fundamental psychological processes. So motivation is one of the fundamental psychological processes. Now, what is importance of this concept? No, one of the important role of psychologist is to understand human behavior, others' behavior and one's own behavior also. And most of the time, being a cerebral being, we want to know the reason why one is doing the way one is doing. So why question becomes very important. We want to understand why aspect of the behavior, because behavior can be observed, but reason behind that behavior cannot be observed, and that has to be inferred. And motivation deals with this aspect of human behavior or anybody's behavior. There can be various kinds this is very important to note in the beginning, that all behaviors may not be motivated. So some behaviors may be very spontaneous, some behavior may be have been done impulsively, means person who is behaving has not put some kind of thought behind that. So it can be impulsive behavior, and some of the behaviors people say that there can be unconscious motivation. So I would like to make it very clear that our focus in today's lecture is on conscious or consciously motivated behavior, the behavior about which the person himself or herself is aware. Now, whenever we want to know the motivation behind, and motivation is basically the reason behind certain behavior, why person is behaving, is person conscious about that, and what kind of reason person has in his or her mind about certain kind of behavior. Though it seems that it's very easy to know why one is behaving, but after lots of research it has been found that it's not easy to know the reason behind some behavior. So motivation that way becomes a very complex area in psychology. But some of the characteristics of motivated behavior, a behavior which is motivated, so person has certain kind of goal in his or her mind, that one has to attain some kind of goal. But what is that goal? Sometimes that goal may be very clear, and sometimes that goal may not be very clear. And another thing about motivated behavior is that this motivation also varies from time to time and person to person, which means for same behavior you will find different motivation from one time to another time in the same person, and also for same behavior different people will have different kind of motivation. So it's not possible that on the basis of observable behavior we can say that same motivation is working behind that. And as I hinted in the beginning that motivation is a very complex area, so there is no clear-cut theory about motivation. So we have various perspectives or various framework from which we look at motivation of human behavior. Though it is possible to have motivation of animal behavior also, but we are restricting in today's lecture to human behavior only. So one of the perspective or one of the viewpoint on motivation is that people behave because of some kind of instinct inside the. So, notion of instinct, it is related with biology. So, when we view human being as a biological being, that all behaviors are biologically guided and biologically directed, means human being is totally biological, and we can understand humans behavior in terms of some biological processes or biological concepts, and one such concept is instinct. Instinct can be basically, it is a kind of energy, and it is very interesting to note that the word motivation is derived from the same root as the word motion, and which is that something that moves an organism. So, as motivation moves organism, similarly motion also moves, and it is because of some kind of energy which is inside the organism. So, human being is a biological being, and every biological being has some kind of energy stored in that, and it is a special kind of energy, and that creates some kind of state of uneasiness, and human being is motivated to release this or to get rid of this state of uneasiness, and in order to get rid of this state of uneasiness, human being releases that energy which is stored inside the body. So, this is one perspective on motivation, that because of the instinct person wants to behave in a certain way. But this perspective has some limitation, because in this we do not know we do not take into account the external factors, and many times we have instinct, but we do not behave, and sometimes without any explicit instinct we behave in certain way. So, instinct perspective is unable to explain this kind of or this aspect of behavior. So, now we will come to different kind of viewpoint on motivation, and that is called drive theories. And now, what is drive theory? Drive is a psychological concept, it is a psychological state. Basically, before drive we have another concept which is called need, and need basically implies or refers to some kind of deficiency. We can understand that why do we feel hungry? We feel hungry because there is deficiency of some element in our body. Or why do we feel thirsty? So, there is some kind of deficiency in our body. So, assumption is that body tries to, or the system in body tries to maintain some kind of equilibrium, and when that equilibrium is disturbed and some kind of deficiency is there because we have spent that resources or that energy, and experience of this deficiency is understood as drive. So, drive is basically a psychological manifestation or psychological experience of some physiological deficiency or physiological need. So, need is the first stage, and which gets translated in psychological form and which we call drive. And it is assumed that organism tries to reduce this drive, because this drive state is not very happy state, it is not a very pleasant state. So, organism has inherent tendency to reduce drive, and we call this drive reduction theory. So, drive reduction theory explains human behavior in terms, so human behavior is directed towards reducing drive, the drive that has, and how that drive is reduced. So, human being will initiate some kind of behavior, and behavior, so if we can understand in terms of hunger drive. So, if there is deficiency of some element in the body, so it will be experienced by human being in terms of hunger drive, and because of hunger drive person will initiate some kind of behavior, so that person can get food, and after having food this deficiency is removed or it is restored in the body, and because of the restoration of certain element which was deficient in the body, so drive gets over and there is no longer experience of drive. But this perspective, though it explains some aspect of behavior, but many a time in our social life, in our normal day to day life, we behave or we get initiated into some kind of behavior despite not having some kind of deficiency, despite not experience some kind of drive. So, drive reduction theory is not able to explain those kinds of behavior. So, now we have another kind of perspective. Within drive reduction theory, another concept were introduced, that is known as state of homeostasis. And what is this concept of homeostasis? It also equates human body with some kind of machine. So, any system, mechanical system or biological system, it wants to maintain some kind of equilibrium, though I have referred to this concept, but in this context, this concept of equilibrium is that state of equilibrium is the inherent tendency of mechanical system or biological system. So, in mechanical system also we see sometimes that when machine works and because of operation of machine, heat is generated and machine cannot operate if heat reaches beyond a point. So, there is this feedback goes into the system and a system starts that tries to reduce, that tries to lower down the temperature, so that optimum level of heat can be restored. Similarly, in the biological being also, no biological being is at the point of complete rest. Our all system are operational. So, in human being we have digestive system, we have nervous system, we have cardiovascular system, we have respiratory system and other systems also, and all systems functions all the time. But in this process of functioning, sometimes this state of equilibrium gets disturbed. So, we say that this state of homeostasis is disturbed, and whenever there is this state of homeostasis is disturbed, so this information goes to brain, and in brain this brain gives information to instruction to some system, so that this state of homeostasis can be restored. And this concept of homeostasis differentiates human beings sometimes from machine, because I have already said that there is some kind of similarity between mechanical system and biological system, but concept of homeostasis is also cognitive, that it is not totally biological, but human being also consciously understand that whether the system is in some kind of equilibrium or it has been disturbed, whereas in mechanical system it is totally automatic. So, there is no question of any kind of conscious reasoning involved in that. But this framework overlooks the power of new stimuli to create certain kind of behavior, because in homeostasis framework what we have understood that there is inherent tendency to restore state of homeostasis, and as soon as this state of homeostasis is restored, then behavior will be over. But human being, it has been found through empirical research and experientially also that homeostasis is not all the time a desirable state of mind. Human being gets bored if there is no behavior or if there is equilibrium. So, sometimes we create some kind of, you can say either tension or some kind of need for ourselves, or we actively seek some kind of new stimuli that stimulates us. So, we need a stimulating environment. Even we observe among small children that small children properly fed, he or she is not feeling thirsty, there is no other kind of biological discomfort, but you will find that child is irritable, child is not happy, child cries, creeps, sometimes demands something from parent. Why? Because we find that child has another kind of need, exploratory need or some kind of stimulation child needs. So, state of equilibrium or homeostasis does not explain this kind of behavior. So, even if we are in a state of homeostasis, but this itself can be a source of motivation, that it is not very happy state of being, we feel very bored. So, we need some kind of stimulation, and if stimulation is not present in the external environment, so we actively seek some kind of, either mentally we can create some kind of stimulation, and that is how we indulge in some kind of creative activity, or we seek for stimulation in our external environment. A new perspective on motivation has come that we call incentive perspectives, because in drive reduction theory, including the concept of homeostasis, it was explaining human behavior in terms of some kind of internal processes, some internal processes that were taking place inside the body. But we know that human behavior cannot be explained only in terms of internal processes, because human being, any real human being exists in a real environment, social environment, and social environment is full of objects, some kind of stimuli, and we also interpret the meaning of these stimuli, we interpret the meaning of our, so we understand our environment and we interpret our environment in certain way. And incentive perspective, it explains that person initiates certain kind of behavior because there is some kind of incentive, there is some kind of positive value attached with that. For example, if I find or a child finds that there is a toy and this toy is not easily available. There is condition that if you fulfill certain condition, only then you can get this toy. Child would be ready to do that behavior, to fulfill that condition. Now we can explain child's this behavior as a motivated behavior, and this behavior child showed because of certain kind of incentive. And what was the incentive in this case? Incentive is toy. Or you take example of students either in school or higher level. Why do students study? One of the explanation for this behavior or study behavior is that they have incentive to do well in the examination, and when they do well they get some kind of reward or they get some kind of praise from their relatives, from their friends, from their teachers, from others also. And this incentive has also long term value, because students know that it is not only they get reward or they get prize, but in long term their career also depends on their performance in examination at various levels. And so this kind of behavior we can explain in terms of incentive, because there is some kind of incentive. Now what is reality? So in drive theory or from drive perspective, we have explained human behavior in terms of some kind of internal mechanism, whereas from incentive perspectives we have explained behavior on the basis of some object or certain things which exist outside the organism, outside the person. So some people call this drive as push factor, that something pushes you to do something, whereas incentive perspective is called or it explains behavior in terms of pull factor. And in fact, in reality, if we try to examine and try to understand why one is behaving, so we find that both factors, the push factors and pull factors, they operate in tandem. So, it is not possible to separate the contribution or role of push factor from pull factor or otherwise or vice versa. So, real behavior can be explained or real behavior is guided by or determined by both push factor and pull factor. Now, there are another concepts also related to motivation and which we call intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And this concept is very, very important, because many behaviors, some of the behaviors may be biologically based, like our hunger, thirst, temperature regulation, sexual behavior. This can be explained to great extent in terms of biological processes, but human beings show a myriad kinds of behavior. So, we participate in some kind of debate, sometimes we take tension. For example, you see that people want to achieve very high, and we know that those who achieve high, they have to work a lot. Politicians, you see that during election time they have to campaign even in harsh situation, and they get tired, but still they are motivated to behave, to take part in certain kind of behavior. So, we want to understand that why people behave even sometimes at the cost of their physical comfort, or sometimes they take psychological tension, or sometimes they invite anxiety also. So, neither drive perspective nor incentive perspective can explain. So, we have another way to understand motivation in terms of intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. So, we start with intrinsic motivation. So, what is intrinsic motivation? Intrinsic motivation refers to that some kind of motivation exists on its own right. So, it is not linked with satisfaction of some kind of biological need, or it is not related with satisfaction of some kind of external needs, or some kind of incentive is there. It is already there. So, we find some people, a creative writer or a singer or dancer or a sports person, there may not be very clear cut explanation for their behavior, but they are engrossed in that, because this motivation exists in the person on its own. It is not related with some kind of instinct, it is not related with some kind of drive, and there may not be some visible incentive also. People, yes, it is possible that later on when person gets recognized and one gets recognition for that, one gets reward and all kinds of reward, monetary reward or a symbolic reward. But if we try to understand the life of creative people, we will find that in initial phase, it is not that they were motivated by this kind of incentive, but they had some kind of urge in themselves. And we know about some great people, some creative people, that even in adverse situation, there was discouragement all around. So, rather than being or having some kind of incentive around, there was discouragement, or there was some kind of adversity. Sometimes there was huge risk also attached with creative behavior, but despite that they took risk. And people explain this kind of behavior in terms of intrinsic motivation, that there is some kind of intrinsic motivation. And another kind of motivation is extrinsic motivation, that there is motivation outside and which is visible, which is observable. So, as we have seen in the case of incentive perspective on motivation, that there is some kind of, but difference between incentive perspective and extrinsic motivation, that in extrinsic in incentive perspective, it's slightly related with some kind of satisfaction of biological need. So, related with our biological being or biological need, whereas this extrinsic motivation is not necessarily related with our biological behavior or some kind of biological processes. There may not be some kind of disequilibrium, there may not be some kind of discomfort in biological term or physical discomfort. But what is this extrinsic motivation? That there is some kind of social value, or person understands certain object or certain kind of reward, that it has value for himself or herself, and because of this external factor or extrinsic factor, person is involved in certain kind of behavior. But again, in real life we find that it's not that any behavior is totally guided by intrinsic motivation or totally guided by extrinsic motivation. We also see that sometimes a behavior which started due to intrinsic motivation, but later on person persists in the behavior because of some extrinsic motivation also got involved. And similarly, certain behavior started due to extrinsic motivation, but later on person developed interest in that behavior and it became a kind of intrinsic motivation. Person develops interest and this motivation existed on its own also. Now, motivation is classified in another way also, and so in today's lecture I will briefly describe about these two kinds of motivation, and I will also discuss one example of each. First is the primary motivation. Primary motivations are basically, we can say, which is biologically based motivation and which is automatic also. That, and in terms of this motivation, there is similarity between a human being and some animal species. Examples are hunger, thirst, temperature regulation and sexual behavior. All these four behaviors are examples of primary motivation, that these behaviors get initiated due to primary motivation, because it has its origin in biological processes, and without understanding biological processes or physiological mechanism, we cannot explain this behavior completely. But at the same time, we should also note that even this primary motivation cannot be understood totally in terms of the biological processes, because human being after being born in society gets socialized also, and because of the process of socialization, this biological behavior also gets its meaning, its cultural meaning and social meaning, and that we will keep in mind. And second kind of motivation we call secondary motivation, and secondary motivation does not have clear biological basis. Sometimes it may start with due to some biological processes also, but later on basically it is result of certain kind of learning, our social learning. Learning is one of the fundamental process of human being or many organisms, and learning process enables us to cope with environment, it helps us to survive in this world and sometimes survive well also, to cope with the reality and to do. And because of the learning, we learn many kinds of needs also. It is not that all the needs which I explained in the beginning in terms of deficiency in the body, but some needs are socially learned. So, those needs do not have their basis in some kind of deficit in body or some kind of disequilibrium in the bodily process, but those needs are learned needs. An example of secondary motivations are need for power, need for affiliation, need for motivation, and need for achievement, need to do well in life. So, these needs cannot be explained in terms of biological processes, because these needs are learned. And since these needs are learned, and we know that in learning culture plays very important role, society's norm plays very important role. So, we find that meaning of these secondary motivations differ from one society to another society, from one culture to another culture. And so, I will discuss about the secondary need, or one example of secondary need in detail. So, let us take first one example of primary need. So, one of the primary need is the hunger. How do we understand hunger? So, one way to understand hunger is that in our blood certain level of glucose is maintained, and whenever this, and we need glucose also, because glucose also produces energy, and we need energy to do certain kind of behavior, and body also needs energy to continue its function. So, energy is very important for living being, and glucose is the source of energy, and that is why body needs to maintain optimal level of glucose in the blood. But because of our activity, this amount of glucose, and how do we get glucose in the, so we take food and food gets converted into glucose, and that is how glucose goes into bloodstream. And there are very complex mechanism in body to maintain this glucose level in the, but whenever due to some reason this glucose level goes down, it gets lowered than the optimal level. So, signal goes to brain, and brain gives signal to the body, and we experience hunger. So, hunger is a psychological concept, and need is the, so there is deficiency of glucose level in the body, and this information is transmitted to the brain, and because of the processing in brain, human being experiences this deficiency in terms of hunger, and because of hunger, then person would be motivated to look for food and to have food. Now, we can understand that how this behavior, hunger behavior gets modified in society or modified by culture. So, hunger is a universal kind of drive. So, in all societies and in all times, the living beings have felt hungry, but how do we satisfy our hunger, that is very much decided by the society. So, what kind of food we will take and how we will take this food. So, we know that in some society there is system of taking food using finger and hand, whereas in another society people use spoon and fork and some other kind of device, or in some society we take freshly cooked food, in some society we preserve food. And why do we preserve food? So, there are explanations that all the time we do not, it is not possible to have freshly cooked food, or in some kind of or some stage in civilization when there was hunting and food gathering society. So, there was no settled life. So, freshly cooked food was not possible. So, they either used to take raw food or they used to carry food, or now even in modern society we find people have become very busy and they do not have time to cook food. We know about some Western society that in some family they cook food only once a week. I heard in extreme cases they cook food once in a month. So, there is now industry that so food processing is a huge industry. So, some kinds of foods are processed and which can be preserved in freeze and through other devices. So, people buy those kinds of processed food and they eat it by heating it up. So, there is a role of culture in satisfying our primary motivation, primary drive also, like hunger also. But about hunger, it is said that hunger drive is also regulated by hypothalamus, and two portions of hypothalamus are responsible for that, ventromedial hypothalamus and lateral hypothalamus. So, ventral part of hypothalamus is responsible for initiation of food seeking behavior. So, whenever the signal comes to brain that there is deficiency of glucose level, so organism feels or experiences hunger, and because of the activation of ventromedial part of hypothalamus, person takes food. Whereas, this lateral part of hypothalamus, no, I think it is other way around. The lateral part of hypothalamus, it allows person to take food, whereas ventromedial part of the hypothalamus, it whenever food, organism or person has taken food and the state of balance or harmony or homeostasis restored, so signal comes to brain, and this ventromedial part of hypothalamus gives instruction to organism to stop taking food. What happens if this part of hypothalamus gets damaged? So, if lateral part of hypothalamus gets damaged, so even if there is deficiency in the body, person will not take food, and if ventromedial part of the hypothalamus gets damaged, so even if person has taken food and energy level is restored, but person will continue to take food. So, it has been found that if ventromedial part of hypothalamus is damaged, person takes excessive food and it results into obesity. So, in sum, although this process is very complex, but for the student of psychology, I think this preliminary description of physiological processes, I think, is sufficient to understand how hunger, which is one of the example of primary motivation, is biologically guided. Now, let us come to the secondary motivation. I have said that there are many kinds of secondary motivation, and one of the important kind of secondary motivation is need for achievement, and psychologists have worked very extensively on need for achievement. Why need for achievement is very important concept. One of the important psychologists whose name was David McClelland, who worked on need for achievement, and he published a book in early 60s, and title of the book was The Achieving Society. And his thesis in that book was that people or society differs in terms of need for achievement. Means in different society and in different culture, people differ in terms of means in some society, in some culture, people are or people have high need for achievement, whereas in some society, other society or in other culture, people have low need for achievement. And another thesis of McClellan was that economic development of society is linked with need for achievement. And his conclusion was that society where people have high need for achievement would be economically developed, and society where people have low need for achievement would be economically underdeveloped. But at the same time, he said that need for achievement can be learned, it can be inculcated in society. But how did he come to this conclusion? What did he do? He analyzed the primary school textbook in different, that is used in different society, and he found that the content of this primary school textbook in different society differ. And after his analysis, he found that especially in economically developed Western society, in this primary school textbook, there is lots of mention of need for achievement, and that is encouraged also. Whereas in the textbook that is used in non-Western society where economic development is not so high, those kinds of needs are not part of the content of primary school textbook. So, David McClellan suggested that through workshop and through other means, it is possible to enhance the need for achievement in society where need for achievement is low among the people. And why we should enhance need for achievement? Because need for achievement is linked with the economic development. So, during 60s and 70s, we know that in many developing society there was clear-cut thrust on economic development. In our country also there was 5-year plan, so there was very planned development. So, our government invited David McClellan in India. He came and organized a workshop in a place in Andhra Pradesh, which is called Kakinada, and their training program was organized to develop need for achievement among some of the selected Indian. Now, what is the result of that? Nobody bothered to check that. So, that was understanding of need for achievement. As I said in the beginning, that need for achievement is not biologically based need, it is learned in society. In some society, this need for achievement is encouraged very much, whereas in another kind of society, this need is not encouraged. Another kind of secondary motivation is need for affiliation or belonging, and it was believed that there is antagonistic kind of relationship between need for achievement and need for affiliation. So, in society where need for achievement is high, need for affiliation would be low, and so, and another kind of society where need for achievement is very high, need for affiliation would be where need for achievement would be low, need for affiliation would be high. So, in society where economic development was not very high, it was found that people have very high need for affiliation, but need for achievement was low. Psychologists, because of the dominance of Western scholars in academics, accepted this thesis for some time, but after some time some Indian psychologists did research in this field and challenged the thesis of David McClelland about need for achievement. And what Indian psychologists argued that the meaning of need for achievement is not same in all the society. And one of the argument was that in Western society, meaning of need for achievement or meaning of achievement is individualistic achievement, that if person achieves certain things without regarding for one's family or near and dear one, so that is considered need for achievement. Whereas in Indian setting and in other non-Western society, individual achievement is not very much encouraged, is not very much valued. Rather, sometimes if person is involved and committed to achieve something individually and one disregards one's family responsibility, one disregards one's social relationship, one is considered very selfish, and this is considered socially undesirable behavior. So, McClelland's conclusion that Indians and other non-Western society is low on need for achievement is not right, because in this society individualistic achievement is not valued, it is not encouraged. Rather, collectivist achievement or taking care of one's family member, taking care of one's relative becomes very important. So, in this kind non-Western society, need for affiliation and need for achievement is not very clear cut. These two needs are not distinct, which are distinct in Western society, in Western culture. Here we are not arguing that one kind of society is superior and another kind of society is inferior, or one kind of cultural practice is better and another kind of cultural practice is not good. It is basically world view, okay? And there are debates that which kind of world view is better, but we do not want to take that point here. But why we have brought this concept, because this concept is very much intrinsically related with concept of need for achievement. So, need for achievement cannot be understood without taking into consideration the cultural aspect of society, because it is culture that provides us meaning to understand certain kind of behavior, and especially this secondary kind of motivation which has no biological basis, so which has basis in societies, because certain kinds of goals are important in society, certain kinds of goals are highly valued. So, people would like to pursue those goals, and certain goals are not so valued, or sometimes those goals are not considered desirable at all. So, we find that people differ in their behavior in society, in different society. I can take example of students' behavior. Let us take school students' behavior in classroom. So, in American setting, if a student is very active, asks question, a lot of question, it is sign of intelligence, that child is very competent. Whereas, in some society, this kind of behavior is not encouraged. It is said that rather students should be very disciplined, should be obedient, and should not speak unless asked for it by teachers. So, same behavior we can see has a different meaning. So, when we observe as a neutral observer, so one can draw very misleading kind of conclusion that in American school children are very intelligent, whereas in Indian kind or Japanese kind of school children are not very intelligent, because they do not ask they are not very active, they do not ask question from the teacher. So this is just one example. Is it they will all no, so they want to ask question?
No, just we are talking about the motivation. So when motivation is an important factor even for the learning and intelligence, so when we analyze on the basis on the intelligence scale and the motivational scale, how studies or the relation has been come out?
I think it's very important question. Although the concept of intelligence itself is a very big area and very one of the fundamental area in psychology, but how do we and no independent lecture can be given on that, but let's try to understand relationship between intelligence and motivation, because like any other psychological concept and processes, intelligence is also non-observable. So we do not observe intelligence per se. What do we observe? We observe the intelligent behavior. But in psychology or in educationists also, how do they measure intelligence? So we have intelligence test. Intelligence test is administered on students, and what do students do? Students respond to the each item of intelligence test, and then psychologist or educationist score the responses of the student, and then give certain kind of score, and those scores are converted in terms of intelligence quotient, which we call IQ. But nowadays this notion of IQ has been challenged also, that it is not necessary that some of the children who get low score or low IQ, they are necessarily very low on intelligence also, because there are many factors that determine our performance on intelligence test, and one of the factor is motivation. So if as a student I am not very motivated to do well on an intelligence test, so despite having intelligence, my performance would not be good. So it would indicate that I have got very low intelligence, because though there is low motivation, not low intelligence. On the other hand, a student having average intelligence, but if he or she is highly motivated, will perform well on the exam, and in terms of his score, one will see that child is very, very intelligent. So motivation and intelligence has got very close relationship. At least the performance on intelligence test is very much influenced by motivation. Similarly, I think we can understand also students' performance in exam also. Generally, we have tendency to explain students' behavior, performance in exam in terms of one's intelligence. But intelligence is just one factor that determines one's performance in examination. But another important factor is motivation. So if one is not motivated, one will not do well in exam.
And what about the learning? Because it is said that when you are motivated to learn something, you will learn faster and you will also retain it. So what the relation between motivation?
Yeah, motivation and learning. You know, now I will cite one very famous studies conducted by one of the important learning theorists. His name was Guthrie, and his name was Tolman. Guthrie is also but this study was conducted by Tolman, and what he did, in psychology, lots of studies have been conducted on rat. So a study was conducted on rat, that how fast rat learns the maze learning. So maze is some in Hindi we call bhul bhulaiya. So that was created. So there was entry point and there was the end point, and there was very complicated zigzag path that leads to the from entry point to the end point, and rat was left to explore the path and route and to reach at the end point. In one condition, no incentive was given to the rat, means no food was given, that was incentive for the rat. and rat may have learned, but it was not shown. But when food was given, rat showed that it has learned how to reach the end point. So here Tolman has distinguished between learning and performance. So Tolman says that in the absence of incentive, learning takes place, but learning is also an intrinsic process. But how do we conclude or how do we infer that learning has taken place? When we see that there is behavior, no, there is change in behavior. So when we see that before this practice, the rat was not able to run through the maze, and after practice, now rat is able to run through the maze. So we conclude that rat has learned how to run through the maze. But Tolman's explanation was that when you observe that rat is able to run through the maze, it is performance. So learning gets manifested in terms of performance when there is incentive. But even in the absence of incentive, there can be learning, which is internal process. So sometimes, but we have some kind of studies which shows that if learner is motivated either intrinsically or extrinsically, I have explained this concept during course of my lecture. So rate of learning becomes fast. If there is no motivation or there is low motivation, learning or speed of learning would be slow. Another factor, if task is very difficult and a student is trying to learn certain things, and if motivation is low, what has been found that child will give up, will not learn. Whereas if task is difficult but motivation is very high, child will not give up and child will persist in learning the task. So these are the relationship between learning and motivation.
Okay. So well friends, with this word we conclude the lecture, and I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on behalf I thank Dr. Arvind Misra for giving such a wonderful lecture on this great topic. Thank you very much.